On January 10, 1860, inside a textile mill in Lawrence, Massachusetts, 800 workers felt the floor shift beneath their feet. There was a sharp rattle. Then a sound like bones cracking inside the walls. Then the entire 5-story building collapsed in less than 10 seconds. Floors pancaked, cast iron columns shattered. 700 looms, weighing hundreds of pounds each, crashed through level after level, dragging screaming workers downward. When the dust settled, a pile of rubble 50 feet high sat where the factory had stood moments before. Inside that rubble, 600 people were trapped alive. And the collapse was not even the worst part. This is the story of the Pemberton Mill, the building that was constructed with defective iron, overloaded beyond its limits, and then set on fire while hundreds of workers were still buried inside it. Textile mills in the mid-1800s were not small operations. They were massive industrial buildings designed to house thousands of moving parts under one roof. The Pemberton Mill was 5 stories tall, 280 feet long, and 84 feet wide. It was built in 1853 under the supervision of Captain Charles Bigelow, an engineer with an established reputation across New England. He had built dams, canals, and machine shops. The mill was financed by John Llewell and his brother-in-law J. Pickering Putnam at a cost of $850,000. That is roughly $32 million today, a fortune even by industrial standards. The structure relied on cast iron columns to support each floor. Hollow cast iron columns were standard in mill construction at the time. They were cheap to produce, strong under compression, and could be cast in large sections using the foundry equipment of the day. But here is where the problem started. These columns were not cast properly. When investigators later cut cross-sections of the surviving pillars, they found the walls were uneven, thick on one side, paper-thin on the other. The result of carelessly set molds at the foundry. Some columns contained air bubbles trapped inside the iron. Others had slag inclusions, pockets of impurity that created weak points built directly into the structure. No one tested them before installation. No one inspected them afterward. They were delivered. They were installed. And for 7 years they held. But holding is not the same as being safe. Holding just means the failure has not happened yet. Why did no one catch these defects? Because there was no way to inspect the interior of a massive iron casting. X-rays did not exist. Ultrasonic testing was more than half a century away. The only method available was visual inspection of the outer surface, which revealed nothing about what was happening inside. Engineers trusted the foundry trusted the molds, and the molds were set carelessly. That chain of assumptions held the building up, and that chain was about to break. In 1857, a financial panic swept the country. Lowell and Putnam needed to sell. George Howe and David Nevins purchased the Pemberton Mill for $500,000, a loss of $350,000 for the original owners. But Howe and Nevins saw opportunity. They were going to make this mill profitable. Their method was simple: more machines, more workers, more production. They crammed additional looms and spindles onto every floor. Heavy iron machinery was packed into a building that was already carrying questionable loads on questionable columns. The 4th floor became particularly overloaded. Workers noticed something. The building shook more than it used to. When the looms ran at full speed, you could feel the vibrations in the walls, in the floor, in your teeth. The owners noticed too. They welded steel plates to beams and girders as reinforcement, patches on a structure that was deteriorating from within. Here is why that matters. The building was earning them $1.5 million a year. That is approximately $51 million in today's money. That kind of revenue makes people ignore vibrations. It makes people trust patches instead of engineers. It makes people add machines instead of subtracting risk. Could you imagine working inside a building that shook every time the machines ran at full speed? If you can, let me know in the comments. Now, this story turns into something far worse than a structural failure. 4:30 in the afternoon, January 10th, A Tuesday, the south wall of the Pemberton Mill bulged outward like something was pushing it from inside. Then the building came down. 5 floors, thousands of tons of brick, iron, and timber. The oak floors, 6 inches thick, pancaked from the center outward. The cast iron columns did not bend. They shattered. 700 looms crashed through floor after floor. The sound was so loud that workers in factories a mile away heard it. The ground shook like a small earthquake. And when the noise stopped, where a 5-story mill had stood, there was a pyramid of twisted iron, splintered beams, pulverized brick, and trapped human beings. Dozens were killed instantly, crushed by falling machinery, buried under brick, impaled by shattered timber. But hundreds survived the initial collapse. They were pinned under looms, wedged between collapsed floors, buried in rubble, but conscious. They could speak, they could cry out, they could beg for help, and help came almost immediately. 2,000 people from the surrounding community rushed to the site. They pulled debris apart with bare hands. They used ropes to drag beams and columns out of the way. They called into the wreckage and passed water and coffee through gaps to trapped workers. City Hall was converted into a temporary hospital. The entire city of Lawrence mobilized in minutes. But it was January in Massachusetts. The sun set early. By 5:30, it was dark. Rescuers could not see. They built bonfires around the perimeter of the rubble pile to light their work. They brought oil lanterns and crawled into the wreckage to reach the trapped. And what they found was the kind of thing that stays with a person for the rest of their life. Faces crushed past recognition. Open wounds where bones showed through a paste of dried blood, brick dust, and shredded clothing. Workers pinned under tons of iron, fully conscious, talking to rescuers, unable to move. Let me tell you about Henry Neese. He was working in the boiler house when the building collapsed. He escaped through a door, fought through debris, and instead of running, he turned back. He found a young woman on the floor of the card room. She was alone in this country. Her mother was in Ireland. A piece of shafting lay across her neck. Her knee was torn open. A roping can rim was pressing into her spine. Neese found a saw and cut the boards and timbers from under her until she could be carried to safety. Then he kept going. He found a man named Darius Nash and a young girl lying close together. The girl was trapped, but cheerful. She told Neese to rescue Nash first because he was lying on her leg, pinned by a spinning frame resting on his side. Neese pushed a strip of board through a hole above them to signal other rescuers. They cut an opening and pulled Nash out, but the machinery trapping the girl could not be moved. Every effort failed. And then the fire came. This is the part that separates the Pemberton Mill from every other building collapse in American history. Around 9:30 that evening, 5 hours after the collapse, 2 rescuers crawled through a crevice in the rubble carrying oil lanterns. They were trying to reach a trapped young woman. One of the lanterns was knocked over. Burning oil spilled onto cotton waste, splintered wood, machine oil that had soaked into everything over 7 years of operation. Here is what you need to understand about the wreckage of a textile mill. Cotton, wood, oil, denim, flannel, all of it saturated with years of industrial grease and lubricant. The rubble pile was essentially a fuel depot with people trapped inside it. The fire spread so fast that the rescuers barely escaped. Within minutes, the entire pile was burning, and inside that pile, hundreds of people were still alive. The crowd that had gathered to help now stood and watched as people they had been speaking to minutes earlier burned to death. 14 people are confirmed to have burned alive in full view of their families. Loved ones stood feet away, separated by walls of flame, completely powerless. A foreman named Maurice Palmer, trapped and watching the fire approach, cut his own throat rather than burn. He was pulled from the wreckage. He survived the wound. He died from his other injuries. A young girl named Mary Bannon, trapped under debris, handed her paycheck to a friend through a gap in the wreckage. She asked her friend to give it to her father, to say goodbye for her. She knew what was coming, and in the final minutes, As the fire consumed the rubble from one end to the other, the trapped workers who could not escape and could not be saved began to sing. They sang church hymns, their voices carrying over the sound of the flames. One by one, those voices went silent. By midnight, the site was quiet. You are probably wondering what happened to the people responsible, and what they concluded will leave you dumbfounded. Between 88 and 145 people died. The exact number was never determined because many of the bodies were burned beyond identification. Most of the dead were young women, Irish immigrants, Scottish immigrants, people who had come to America during the potato famine and economic collapse, looking for work, looking for safety. They found the Pemberton Mill instead. A jury was assembled to investigate, and the findings were damning. The cast iron columns were defective. The foundry had produced substandard castings with uneven walls and internal flaws. Charles Bigelow had allowed malformed columns to be installed without testing or inspection. The walls of the building were too thin for a structure of that size. The windows were too large, displacing necessary structural brick. The mortar was weak. And then Howe and Nevins had overloaded the entire building far beyond its already questionable capacity. The Scientific American wrote that there was no doubt the collapse was caused by gross negligence and want of fidelity in casting the columns. The jury found Bigelow responsible. But here is what happened next. Nothing. Bigelow did not go to prison. Howe did not go to prison. Nevins did not go to prison. No one from the foundry faced charges. No one paid a fine. No one received any legal consequence for the deaths of up to 145 people. Why was no one punished? Because the legal framework did not exist. Industrial safety law in 1860 was virtually non-existent. Workers had almost no protections. Employers had almost no obligations. A building could be constructed with defective materials, loaded past capacity, and allowed to collapse. And the response was an investigation, a finding, and a handshake. Instead of justice, a relief fund was established. Amos Lawrence, a textile heir, assembled 20 wealthy industrialists to contribute. Heads of household who lost a breadwinner received up to $500. But the young women and teenage girls who made up most of the dead were valued at $50 to $100 each by the committee distributing the funds. Even in death, their lives were assessed at a fraction of what a man's was worth. David Nevins bought out his partner. He rebuilt the Pemberton Mill on the same site. The new building opened later that same year, 1860. New workers were hired, many of them immigrants with no other options. Those new workers reported something unsettling. They said they saw figures walking the aisles of the rebuilt mill, shapes that moved between the machines and then vanished. Whether you believe in that sort of thing or not, the reports persisted for years. The rebuilt Pemberton Mill still stands today on Canal Street in Lawrence, Massachusetts. A section of one of the original defective columns is on display at the Lawrence Heritage State Park Visitor Center. You can see the uneven walls for yourself, thick on one side, dangerously thin on the other. What did the Pemberton Mill teach the industry? The same lesson that flywheels and boilers and every other industrial failure taught. That cast iron can look strong and be rotten at its core. That inspection matters more than reputation. That buildings do not give warnings before they fail. They just fail. But the Pemberton added something else. It's taught that the worst part of a disaster is not always the disaster itself. It is what happens next. People who survived the collapse. People who were conscious and talking. People who had been given water and told to hold on. People who believed they were going to be rescued. Then a lantern tipped over, and everything changed. There was a girl, Henry Nice, whom rescuers could not free. She was the one who told rescuers to save Nash first. She was cheerful despite being trapped under a spinning frame for hours. The fire reached her, and her young life went out amid the scorching heat. Those are the exact words from a contemporary account written in 1860. She did not panic. She did not beg. She told rescuers to save someone else first, and the reward for her courage was to burn alive in the ruins of a building that should never have been built the way it was built, loaded the way it was loaded, or ignored the way it was ignored. That is the story of the Pemberton Mill, the factory built with defective iron, overloaded for profit. It collapsed on 800 workers and then was set on fire while many were still trapped inside. This was a disaster where no one was punished. The building was rebuilt on the same ground within the same year by the same owner. Thanks for tuning in. For more stories about the machines and buildings that killed the people who worked inside them, check the videos on screen. And if you want to see what we investigate next, subscribe.